So, let's go. Number 1. Thrown to the Lampreys. A slave's fingers slip on a Naples terrace, and a single crystal cup shatters across the mosaic floor, and every guest goes quiet, because they all know what the pool at the far end of the room is for. Below the marble rim, dark eel-shaped bodies are already stirring. This was the household of Vedius Pollio, a Roman knight of the age of Augustus, the son of a freed slave who had climbed into staggering wealth. On the coast near Naples, he built the villa Posillipo, and among its luxuries he kept great saltwater ponds stocked with marina, the moray eels the Romans prized above almost any other fish. The eels were not truly lampreys, though the tradition would blur the two for centuries. A Roman moray could reach 1.5 meters, and it carried a second set of jaws, deep in its throat, that pulled prey backward down its gullet. Wealthy Romans doted on them. Pliny the Elder tells us the orator Hortensius wept when a favorite eel died, and that the noblewoman Antonia hung earrings on one she loved. Into this world of pampered fish came the broken cup. The story is preserved by Seneca, by Pliny, and by Cassius Dio. At a banquet around 15 BCE, with the Emperor Augustus himself reclining as a guest, a young slave dropped and shattered a piece of Pollio's crystal. Pollio ordered him seized and thrown to the eels. The boy tore free and fell at the emperor's feet, and Seneca tells us he begged not for his life, but only for a different way to die. Anything but being eaten alive. Here the horror sharpens into something you can hold. A cup had broken. That was the whole offense. And the answer proposed for it was to feed a living human being to fish for sport, at dinner as entertainment. Augustus was revolted. He ordered every crystal cup in the house smashed on the spot, and he commanded the fishpond filled in. The most powerful man in the world used his mercy to shame a rich man's cruelty in front of his own guests. Historians read the episode in several ways. To the Roman moralists, it was a set piece, a warning about what happens when anger and luxury combine, and Seneca uses it to argue that rage turns wealth into savagery. Some scholars are skeptical that any slave truly died, and note the sources dwell on the intent, on the near miss, more than on a corpse. Later Christian writers seized the tale as proof of pagan Rome's rotten heart. What lingers is the arithmetic of it. A man could weigh a shard of glass against a person's body and find the body worth less. Pollio died 2 years later and left much of his fortune, including that villa, to Augustus, whose ruins you can still walk through today. But the pond he filled in did not bury the story. That survived precisely because it was monstrous, and because even Rome, which was rarely squeamish, decided this one was worth remembering as a warning. Number 2. The Mongol Bloodless Execution. On the open steppe, a heavy felt carpet lies rolled in the grass, and a line of riders is already forming. And the strange thing, the thing that stops you, is that this careful arrangement is a mark of respect for the man sewn inside it. To the Mongols, the blood of a ruler or a great noble was not to be spilled onto the earth. The soul lived in the blood, and to pour it out on the ground was to commit a kind of pollution against the world itself. So for the highborn, the Mongols engineered deaths that shed no blood. The condemned might be wrapped in carpets, or felt and trampled beneath galloping horses. A noble's back might be broken, or he might be strangled, so that his skin was never pierced. For a commoner, none of this applied. A commoner could be beheaded in the ordinary way, blood and all. The taboo was a privilege of rank. The most famous case is the death of Al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid caliph of Baghdad. In 1258, the Mongol commander Hulagu Khan took the city and ended 5 centuries of the caliphate. Marco Polo and the Persian historian Rashid al-Din record that the caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, so that no royal blood would touch the ground. Other accounts say he was instead sealed up with his own hoarded treasure and left to starve. Another bloodless end. The sources do not agree, and both versions may carry a grain of the truth. Behind all of it stood the Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan. Its full text is lost, and we reconstruct it from later writers, but it governed how and whom the Mongols killed. European travelers who reached the Mongol court in the 1240s and 50s, men like Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and William of Rubruck, carried back first-hand descriptions of these customs to a disbelieving West. The historians divide here in a familiar way. To many, the carpet execution is exactly what it appears: a literal ritual that granted a defeated ruler a clean, honorable death fitted to his status. To the skeptics, the vivid carpet story is legend, grown over a plainer death by starvation. To those who study the sack itself, the caliph's killing was the symbolic climax of a catastrophe, the deliberate silencing of an ancient line. And that is where the stakes bite. This was an execution designed around what must not be spilled, a killing shaped by reverence. Mercy and murder were folded into the same act, the same rolled carpet. The fall of Baghdad may have cost hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps far more, and the libraries burned until the river was said to run dark. Yet the one death everyone remembered was the quiet one, the man crushed without a wound, because it was too strange and too ceremonial for the chroniclers to explain in any ordinary language. Number 3. Sinis the Pine-Bender. On the narrow road across the Isthmus of Corinth, a big, friendly bandit stops a traveler and asks for a hand bending down a pine tree. And he is smiling, and that smile is the last kind thing that will happen. This is Sinis, called Pityakamtes, the Pine-Bender, one of the monsters of Greek legend who haunted the roads before the hero Theseus cleared them. His method gave him his name. In one version, he bent 2 tall pines down to the ground, lashed a victim between them, one limb to each tree, and released them, so that the trees sprang apart and tore the body in 2. In another version, he tricked travelers into helping him haul a single pine down, then let go, flinging them through the air to their deaths on the rocks. The name itself is built from the Greek words for pine and for bending. Theseus, on his journey from Troezen to Athens, killed Sinis by his own method, and this poetic justice is part of a pattern. Along that road, Theseus destroyed a whole gallery of villains, each with their own cruelty, and each undone by it. The story is told by Plutarch in his Life of Theseus, by Apollodorus, by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, and by the traveler Pausanias, who centuries later still pointed out the landmarks tied to the legend. Consider the physics, because the ancients understood it perfectly well. A bent tree is a spring. A young sapling hauled to the ground stores real energy, and a mature pine could store enough to break a body apart when it whipped upright. The method is mechanically plausible, which is part of why it's stuck in the imagination. Here's where the account grows contested, and it is worth slowing down for. Were figures like Sinis real brigands whose crimes were exaggerated into myth, or were they always pure story? Some ancient writers themselves took the rationalizing view, treating these road monsters as real robbers dressed up by poets. Others read them as symbols, as the archaic Greek fear of the lonely road made into flesh. And a third reading treats the whole sequence as a literary machine, each villain a mirror in which the hero's virtue is defined by the vice he ends. Whichever way you turn it, the image does its work. There is a daughter in the tale, Perigune, who hid from Theseus in a patch of wild asparagus and later bore him a son, Melanippus, so that even the monster's bloodline threaded into the heroes. And one tradition says Theseus founded or refounded the Isthmian Games in the shadow of this killing. The reason the Pine-Bender belongs here is the sheer engineering of the cruelty. This was not a blade or a fire. It was a body made into the release point of stored violence, a person turned into the trigger of a trap. The Greeks remembered it not as history, but as something worse, a thing so vivid it had to be told as myth, because myth was the only shelf strong enough to hold it. Number 4. The Five Paines. In a courtyard of the Qin dynasty, a chancellor kneels while a clerk reads aloud a short list, and the list has 5 items, and they will happen to him in order. The man is Li Si, one of the most powerful ministers China had ever produced, and the list is the 5 punishments, the Wu Xing, the backbone of ancient Chinese penal law. The classic 5, in their older form, were a catalog of loss. First, tattooing or branding the face, a permanent public mark. Second, cutting off the nose. Third, amputating the feet. Fourth, castration. And fifth, death, which in the worst cases was not a clean beheading, but something slower. In the harshest sentences, these were not alternatives. They were stacked, inflicted one after another on the same body before the end. Li Si's death, recorded by the great historian Sima Qian in the records of the Grand Historian, is the textbook example. In 208 BCE, the chancellor who had helped build the Qin state was condemned and, by tradition, tattooed, his nose cut, his feet cut, then castrated, and finally cut in 2 at the waist. That last method, the waist chopping, severed a person across the middle and left them conscious, for a time, in the halves of their own body. Such cruelty did not go unquestioned, even then. In 167 BCE, the Han Emperor Wen reformed the mutilating penalties, moving toward flogging and hard labor, and the histories record that he was moved by a petition from a young woman named Chunyu Tiying, pleading for her condemned father. Centuries later, the 5 punishments were rewritten again into a milder scheme of death: penal servitude, exile, and beating with a heavy or a light stick. We know these details with unusual precision because of what came out of the ground. In 1975, at Shuihudi in Hubei, archaeologists opened a tomb packed with bamboo legal strips from the Qin era, and scholars such as the sinologist Anthony Hulsaway used them to reconstruct exactly how this system worked in practice. The reach of Qin justice extended past the condemned man himself. For grave offenses, the law could invoke the extermination of the 3 clans, killing an offender's relatives across the generations, so that a single crime erased a family. And castration was not always a death sentence in disguise. The historian Sima Qian himself was castrated in 99 BCE rather than executed, and chose that mutilation over suicide so that he could finish his great history, which is the very reason we know so many of these stories at all. One clarification matters. The infamous death by slow slicing, lingqi, is a much later method and a separate thing entirely, and it belongs to other chapters of this grim story, not to the 5 Paines. What the Wu Xing represents is different, and in its way, stranger. This was not a mob or a tyrant's whim. It was cruelty written into statute, a graded ladder of bodily loss administered by clerks and codified in law books. The historians read it through the legalist philosophy that shaped the Qin, the belief that punishment must be harsh and certain to deter. Some see cold statecraft, cruelty as the price of order. Others read the later reforms as the slow dawning of a conscience. But the horror at the center is the bureaucracy of it, the sense that someone sat down and decided the correct sequence in which to take a human being apart and then filed it. Number 5. Peine Forte at Dure. An old man lies on the stone floor of a Salem jail with a heavy board across his chest, and one by one they add stones, and when they pause to ask again whether he will plead, he answers with 2 words: more weight. This was Giles Corey, and the date was September 19th, 1692, and the method killing him was called Peine Forte et Dure, the hard and forceful punishment. Its purpose was not, at first, to kill. It was to force a choice. Under English common law, a trial could not begin until the accused entered a plea, guilty or not guilty. A prisoner who refused, who stood mute, jammed the whole machinery of justice. And so the law devised a way to squeeze a plea out of a silent man. He was laid on his back, a board or a door placed over him, and heavy stones and iron loaded on, more and more, until he either spoke or died. The practice was formalized in England after the Statute of Westminster in 1275, and it carried a bitter logic. A man convicted of a felony forfeited his property to the crown, ruining his heirs. But a man who never entered a plea could never be convicted, and so his estate stayed with his family. This gave some prisoners a terrible reason to stay silent and be crushed. By refusing to plead, they were pressed to death, but they died with their land intact. That is exactly what Giles Corey did. By standing mute under the stones, he prevented the conviction that would have stripped his farm, and he kept it for his sons-in-law. His endurance turned him into a symbol, and those two words, more weight, became a byword for defiance against a rotten process. The pressing could take hours, or, for Corey, days, and prisoners were often given only a few mouthfuls of stale bread and stagnant water between sessions. The historians file this one carefully. In strict legal terms, it was not a sentence at all, but a procedure, a means to obtain a plea, which is how the courts justified it to themselves. In plainer terms, it was sanctioned torture, coercion by suffocation, and later commentators wrote about it with visible unease. In the cultural memory, it became the story of one stubborn old man and his last, flattening breath. England abolished the practice in 1772, when standing mute was finally made equal to a guilty plea, and softened it again in 1827, when silence was treated instead as a plea of not guilty. The legal writer Blackstone described the method, and the records of the Old Bailey preserve its use. The horror here is quieter than fire or beasts, and somehow worse for it. No blade, no flame, only a technicality. Only the need for a spoken word, answered with the slow mathematics of accumulating weight. A man could be killed not for what he did, but for what he would not say. Number 6. The snake pit. Bound at the wrists and lowered into a dark earthen pit, a Viking king hears the dry rustle before his eyes adjust, and understands what is moving in the shadows around his feet, and he begins, of all things, to sing. This is Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Norse warrior, and the pit of snakes, the Ormgarder, is one of the most enduring images the sagas ever produced. In the story, Ragnar is captured by King Ella of Northumbria and cast into the pit to die among the serpents. And as he dies, he recites a death song, the Krakumal, boasting of his battles and laughing at death. His sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, would come to avenge him with a terrible retribution of their own. The snake pit appears elsewhere in Norse legend too. In the Volsunga saga, the hero Gunnar is thrown into just such a pit by Atli, and plays a harp with his toes to charm the snakes, dying last of all. Our sources are medieval, chiefly the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus around the year 1200, and the Icelandic sagas that gathered these tales into writing generations after the events they claim to describe. The death song itself, the Krakumal, is a later skaldic poem framed as Ragnar's dying words, boasting that he had hewn with the sword and would die laughing, and it fixed the scene of the singing king in the imagination of the North. And here the account demands a moment of honesty, because the reality resists the legend. Northern Europe's only native venomous snake is the adder, and an adder's bite, while painful, rarely kills a healthy adult quickly. A pit of adders is a nightmare, but it is not an efficient way to execute a strong man. Which raises the real question, and it is worth pausing on. Did Ragnar Lothbrok even exist? Many historians think he is a composite. Several 9th century Viking leaders fused into one legendary figure, and that the snake pit is dramatic embellishment rather than sober record, perhaps borrowed from older serpent imagery further south. So the readings split. To the saga tradition, the pit is a stage for heroism, a place to show a man singing in the face of death, which was the whole point. To the skeptic, it is literary decoration grown over a plainer end. To the comparative scholar, the writhing pit is a wandering motif, a horror that travels from story to story because it works. That is exactly why it belongs here. The snake pit is terror by slowness, the opposite of a clean blade. It is the crawl of something you cannot see, the death that takes its time, and the courage required to face it becomes the measure of the hero. No archaeologist has ever dug up a snake pit. It survives entirely in words, and yet those words have proved stronger than stone, carrying the image down 1,000 years intact, because a slow death in the dark is a fear that never goes out of date. Number 7. The Gridiron. Over a bed of glowing coals in a Roman courtyard, a deacon is stretched on an iron grill, and according to the tradition, he turns his head to his executioners and tells them, with the last of his humor, that he is done on this side, and they can turn him over. This is St. Lawrence of Rome, and the date is August 10th, 258, during the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Valerian. The gridiron, the criticula, was an iron lattice set over hot coals, and to roast a living person on it was to kill them slowly, deliberately, with the fire kept low. Lawrence was one of the 7 deacons of Rome, and, by tradition, the guardian of the church's treasure. Ordered to hand that treasure over, he is said to have gathered the poor and the sick of the city, and presented them to the authorities as the true wealth of the church. And for that defiance, he was condemned. The story of the gridiron comes down through the poet Prudentius, writing in the early 5th century, and through Ambrose of Milan, and it gave Lawrence the emblem he carries in art forever after, the iron grill. Churches named San Lorenzo across Europe honor him, and the great Spanish palace of the Escorial was laid out, it is said, in the shape of his gridiron. Even the sky was enlisted. The meteors that streak across mid-August, the Perseids, were once called the Tears of St. Lawrence, because they fall around his feast day. It is important to place the gridiron carefully among its neighbors, because fire appears more than once in this catalogue of horrors. This is not the brazen bull, the hollow bronze beast in which victims were sealed and roasted. It is not the pyre of the stake. It is an open grill, and the cruelty is specifically in the turning, in the slow, methodical cooking of a living body. And here, the record itself grows uncertain, which is worth admitting plainly. Many historians doubt that Lawrence died on a gridiron at all. Beheading was the standard Roman execution for his time and status, and the gridiron may be a later symbolic elaboration, a way of making his suffering vivid and memorable. So the readings divide. Some take the roasting literally. Others read it as hagiography, an image built to dramatize the plain Latin word for suffered. Others study how devotion itself, rather than any court record, carried this particular horror down the centuries. However he actually died, the image endured because it fused agony with a strange, defiant lightness, a man joking on the coals. And it captures the essential logic of the cruelest punishments. The fire was kept low on purpose. The suffering was measured out in time. The point was never a quick death. The point was slowness, and everyone watching understood it. Number 8. Boiling alive. In the open space at Smithfield, Just outside the walls of London, a cook stands chained above a cauldron that is already steaming, and the crowd has gathered to watch a cooking pot do the work of an executioner. The cook is Richard Roos, and the year is 1532, and he is about to become the first person put to death under one of the strangest laws Henry VIII ever passed. The year before, in 1531, Parliament had passed the Act for Poisoning, which made boiling to death the legal penalty for murder by poison. Rose had poisoned a household pot of porridge, killing 2 people, and for that he was boiled alive in public. A servant named Margaret Davy would meet the same end at the same place in 1542. The law was short-lived, repealed in 1547, but while it stood, it turned a kitchen cauldron into an instrument of the state. The method took different forms across the world. Sometimes the condemned was lowered by chains into a vat of boiling water, slowly, to prolong the death. Sometimes the liquid was not water, but oil or molten lead, which burned far hotter than boiling water and make the death more savage still. The horror was intimate and domestic. The cauldron was an object from every hearth. The pot that made the daily meal turned into a thing that unmade a person. Why poisoners of all criminals? Because poison frightened the powerful in a particular way. It was secret, premeditated, and almost impossible to guard against. A poisoner could be anyone at the table, a cook, a servant, a trusted hand. And so the answer the law reached for was a punishment as horrifying as the crime felt. A public spectacle meant to terrify anyone who might reach for the vial. The practice was not only European. In China, boiling in a great bronze vessel appears in the histories of the warring states and the Han. The records of the Grand Historian describes the threat of the cauldron, and the diplomat Li Yiji was reportedly boiled alive in 203 BCE. Even legend carried the image. Early Christian tradition held that the Apostle John was plunged into boiling oil in Rome and emerged unharmed, a miracle that only makes sense against a real and recognized punishment. The historians read the boiling laws as pure deterrence, and as a window into the anxieties of the elite, who feared the quiet crime of poison more than open violence. Others read the cauldron as a dark inversion of the hearth, the symbol of home and nourishment turned lethal. That is the horror that outlasts the details. Fire in a pit, a beast in an arena. These are alien things. But a cooking pot is familiar. To die in one is to be killed by the most ordinary object in the world, and the law that ordered it was repealed within a generation, because even in a hard age, some methods proved too much to keep. Number 9. The Tarpeian Rock. A man is marched up the Capitoline Hill to the edge of a sheer cliff, with the temples of Rome at his back, and the city's rooftops far below his feet. And the terrible irony is that he once saved this very hill. His name is Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, and around 384 BCE he is thrown to his death from the Tarpeian Rock, the same summit he had defended from the Gauls. The Tarpeian Rock was a steep cliff on the southern crest of the Capitoline, and from it Rome hurled certain criminals to their deaths. Traitors, murderers, and perjurers were the usual victims, and to be thrown from the rock carried a special disgrace, a public casting down from the sacred heart of the city. The drop was roughly 25 meters, around 80 feet, onto the rocks below, and if the fall did not kill at once, the fall was finished by other means. The rock took its name from Tarpeia, a figure of Rome's foundation legends, said to be a vestal or commander's daughter who betrayed the citadel to the enemy Sabines. In the story, the Sabines she let in crushed her to death beneath their shields, and the cliff carried her name and her infamy forever after. So the place of execution was itself a monument to treachery punished. The case of Manlius is the one that stings. He was a hero, the man whose alertness, warned by the sacred geese, had saved the capital during the Gaulish siege. Years later, he was accused of stirring up the common people and seeking to make himself a king, and for that he was condemned and thrown from the rock, executed within sight of the scene of his greatest glory. The Romans made a proverb of it. The Tarpeian Rock, they said, is close to the capital, meaning that the height of honor and the pit of ruin are neighbors, a single short walk apart. Our knowledge comes from Livy, from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, from Plutarch, and from later writers who mention the rock into the imperial age. Precipitation, killing by throwing from a height, was not unique to Rome. Sparta cast condemned men into a chasm called the Kaiadas, and Delphi had its own execution cliff. Roman topographers still argue over exactly which part of the Capitoline held the Tarpeian Rock. The threat of it lived in Roman politics as well as its practice. A tribune could menace an enemy with the rock, and slaves guilty of certain crimes could be hurled from it too, so that the cliff hung over the whole city as a standing warning. The readings gather around its meaning. To most, it was civic and religious spectacle, punishment staged at the city's holy summit. To the archaeologists, it is a puzzle of location. To those who read Rome's symbols, it was ideology in stone, the traitor literally thrown down from the citadel he had betrayed. And that is where it bites hardest. The state would take even its own heroes and throw them from the height they had defended. Manlius saved the capital and died beneath it. The rock made the lesson plain. In Rome, no service and no glory placed you beyond the reach of that final vertical drop. Number 10. Stoning. In a dusty square, a man steps forward with a stone in his hand, and by the letter of the law, he must be the one to throw first, because he is the witness whose testimony condemned the person standing before him. Stoning, or lapidation, is one of the oldest forms of execution humanity ever devised, and its horror is that it belongs to everyone present. Its logic is the logic of the crowd. There is no single executioner, no headsman, no one hand to carry the guilt. The whole community throws, and so the whole community shares both the act and the responsibility. Stones are everywhere and cost nothing, which is part of why the method reaches back so far, into the ancient Near East, into Greece, into the earliest written codes of law. The Torah prescribes stoning for a range of offenses, among them blasphemy, idolatry, and the breaking of sacred law. But Jewish tradition did not leave it to chaos. The Mishnah, in the tractate Sanhedrin, lays out a regulated procedure in which the condemned was first pushed from a height to hasten death, and only then were stones used, and the witnesses whose evidence had convicted were required to cast first. The intent, remarkably, was to make an unbearable thing as swift as its own rules allowed. The most famous single case in the Western record is the stoning of Stephen, described in the Acts of the Apostles, remembered as the first Christian martyr, killed around the year 34. Greek tradition has its own examples, from the near stonings in Homer to the death of Palamedes. Rome, by contrast, rarely made stoning a formal legal penalty, though mob lapidation certainly happened when a crowd turned. The roots run deeper still. The law codes of ancient Mesopotamia, the world of Hammurabi and his successors, reference communal punishments of this kind, tying the practice to the boundary and purity offenses of early farming societies, where a broken taboo was felt as a threat to the whole village. The death itself comes from cumulative blunt force, blow upon blow, chiefly to the head, and it can be drawn out, which is part of its cruelty. The historians read the method in layers, as communal enforcement of a society's deepest norms, a way for a whole people to police its own boundaries, as a tension between the regulated procedure the law described and the mob reality that so often replaced it, and as a moral problem, the transformation of the ordinary citizen into an executioner. That last reading is the one that unsettles most. In fire and beast and cliff, there is at least a specialist, an official, someone whose job the killing is. In stoning, there is no such distance. The baker, the farmer, the neighbor, each picks up a stone, and each throws, and by the end, no one can say that they alone did it, and everyone did. The method survived across millennia precisely because it needed nothing but a crowd and the ground beneath their feet, and because it bound a community together in the one act it could never take back. Number 11. Drawn and quartered. On a hurdle dragged through the mud of London, a Scottish leader can see the gallows at Tyburn drawing closer, and he understands that the hanging waiting for him there is only the first of 5 things that will be done to his body. The man is William Wallace, and the date is August 23rd, 1305, and the punishment is the one English law reserved for the worst crime it knew, high treason. The full sentence was a sequence, each stage designed to add suffering and dishonor. First, the condemned was drawn, dragged to the place of execution, tied to a wooden hurdle. Then he was hanged, but cut down while still alive. Then he was disemboweled and mutilated before his own eyes. Then beheaded. And finally his body was cut into 4 quarters, and the quarters and the head were carried off and displayed in public places, on bridges and city gates, often parboiled and coated in tar, to preserve them against the weather. The penalty was formalized under King Edward I. One of its earliest victims was the Welsh prince Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283, and Wallace followed 22 years later. Women convicted of treason were not quartered, but burned at the stake. Instead, because the public disemboweling of a woman's body was thought indecent to display, a grim courtesy that spared the crowd, not the victim. The method reached its most famous stage with the gunpowder plot of 1606, when the conspirators were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, though several, and Guy Fawkes among them, cheated the worst of it by dying on the drop. The lawyer Sir Edward Coke spelled out a theological justification for each stage of the ritual, treating the dismemberment as a kind of sermon written on the body. The point was never simply death. Ordinary hanging killed just as surely and far faster. The point was to keep going after death, to unmake the traitor's body and scatter it, to send pieces of him to the corners of the realm as a warning. It was execution, mutilation, and political theater fused into a single afternoon. The historians read it as deterrence, as the state's ultimate answer to rebellion. They read it as theater aimed at the traitor's body and his legacy at once. And they read it as ritual dishonor, a punishment that pursued a man past the moment of his death. In time, even England drew back. The disemboweling was quietly dropped in the early 19th century, and quartering was abolished by the Forfeiture Act of 1870. The horror that remains is the design of it, a death engineered to continue after life had ended, mutilation as a message nailed above a gate. A quick death, the law seemed to say, was too merciful for a traitor. So it built a punishment that would not stop. Trace how each of these methods reached us, and a strange pattern appears. They did not survive because someone kept a careful register of horrors. They survived by accident, through the side doors of history. The Roman moralists preserved the tale of Vedius Pollio and his eels not as record, but as a warning, a scandal repeated to make a point. The gridiron of St. Lawrence came down through devotion, carried by the faithful rather than any court. The snake pit of Ragnar and the pine trees of Sinis survived as saga and myth, outside every archive, and the pressing under stones, the boiling of poisoners, the quartering of traitors reach us because they were written into statute, and statutes leave a paper trail. Notice, too, how often the language itself did the work of hiding. Peine forte et dure means only the hard and forceful punishment, a phrase that says nothing of stones crushing a chest. The 5 pains sounds almost abstract until you learn what the 5 were. Cruelty dressed in the calm vocabulary of law becomes easier to record and easier to forget, and that was frequently the point. Rome had a formal tool for erasure, the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, in which a person's name was chiseled from monuments as if they had never lived. Every chronicle was written by someone with a reason to remember one thing and bury another. Victors decided which atrocities became history and which dissolved into silence. And when a society finally turned against a method, the turning left its own mark. England repealed the boiling law within 16 years. It abolished pressing in 1772 and quartering in 1870. The Han Emperor Wen softened the mutilating punishments as early as 167 BCE. These reforms are fossils of discomfort, the moments a state disowned what it had once done in public. So the real lesson of the phrase, "too cruel for the records," is a humbling one. What we know is only the fraction that slipped through, the deaths loud enough, or useful enough, or holy enough to be written down. Behind each of these named horrors stand countless unnamed ones, punishments inflicted and never recorded. Victims whose suffering left no saga, no statute, no saint's day. The archive is not a mirror of the past. It is a narrow window, and most of the room beyond it lies in the dark. Set these 11 methods side by side, and the shared design becomes impossible to miss. Almost every one of them slows death down. The fire kept low on the gridiron, the stones added one at a time, the descent by inches into the cauldron, the 5 panes stacked in sequence. The goal was rarely a quick end. It was suffering measured out over time, and everyone involved understood it. Spectacle runs through them all. The market square at Smithfield, the cliff at the city's summit, the scaffold at Tyburn, the crowd with stones in a dusty street. These punishments were performances, staged where people would gather and watch and carry the memory home. Their logic was deterrence, the belief that visible horror could frighten a population into obedience. And it is no accident that the most theatrical deaths were reserved for the crimes that most frightened the powerful, treason and poison above all. Ritual shaped the method as surely as cruelty did. The Mongols killed their nobles without spilling blood to honor a taboo. The Jewish law built a careful procedure around the stoning to hasten it within its own rules. Even the most savage of these deaths followed a code, a sense of the right way to do a terrible thing. And running under all of it is disproportion, a broken cup, a refused plea, a whispered accusation, answered with agony out of all measure to the offense, and answered differently depending on rank. The noble granted a bloodless death or a clean blade, while the commoner was given something worse. The body became the canvas on which the state wrote its power, and it wrote in mutilation and display and dismemberment. We have, at least, named that power for what it is. When the nations of the world drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, they wrote into its 5th article that no one shall be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment, a single sentence set against all these centuries of ingenuity and pain. These methods were never random savagery. They were structured institutions, coldly designed, carefully recorded when they were recorded at all. To study them is not to wallow in horror, but to see clearly what human beings have been willing to build, and to measure how far and how recently we have chosen to move away from it. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.